I've always said we follow the money. And whether it's terrorism or attacks based on ideology or attacks on institutions of faith or people of faith, someone's paying for it. And we are reverse tracing those steps. We are not stopping at the perpetrator themselves. We are reverse engineering to hold those accountable in our investigations to who funded them and knowingly funded them. And we will bring the appropriate steps against them with our partners at DOJ.
Okay. Sounds good. Also sounds extremely confusing. This stuff gets very confusing for those of us who don't understand this network, NGOs, the nonprofits, and the Arabella advisors. And how does all this stuff work? Well, there's nobody better to explain this stuff than the great Mike Benz. You're well familiar with him if you watch this show, executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. Mike, I don't understand. Follow the money, NGOs. How's this translate into Antifa terror? Can you please explain it?
Yes, I think what Cash is referring to here is the flow of funds that go from what they're called non-governmental organizations. Of course, anytime you need to put the first thing about yourself is that you're not something else. Uh, that's usually a tell. I don't need to describe myself as a non-governmental individual. I think if I had to say that as the introduction, you'd probably think I'm a Fed. But the fact is these non-governmental organizations, you can think of them as kind of like stem cells. They're stem cells of the political influence world, and they can take many forms. They can be cutouts for government action when the government wants to do something, but it's either illegal or it would be controversial or scandalous. It is farmed out in the same way that the military uses private military contractors for dirty work that they don't want to say was authorized directly by the US government. Governments do the same with NGOs, and so do billionaires and multinational corporations. They will donate to a outside contractor effectively in the form of a nonprofit. And what that means is that the nonprofit is simply not making a profitable product or service. Their their customer is their sponsor. So they are essentially hitmen for hire. They are contract killers in a sense for the sponsors who pay them to do whatever it is they are being paid by the sponsors to do. And when you're talking about these Antifa networks, the networks are juiced by NGO money, by nonprofit world money, by this kind of stem cell like money. And there's a few ways to look at that in terms of what's in the news now about Trump, his Truth Social post about declaring Antifa a terrorist organization. This, by the way, I should note, is not new territory for Trump. In May 2020, he tweeted out at the time when he still had his active Twitter during the 2020 election cycle that he was going to be declaring Antifa a terrorist organization. That did not happen at the time, even though he tweeted that out. And so we have this Truth Social message. We don't know if there's any punch behind it in terms of any sort of executive classification. We're still waiting for details. But what we do know is that these groups that are in the spotlight right now of the FBI investigation, the New York Post reported that that groups like Armed Queers, Salt Lake City, and the like are being investigated right now in the probe into network for potential coordination or advanced foreknowledge and the like. But these groups are entirely run on NGO money, and that NGO money is downstream of both governments and billionaire, uh, secular, ideological, and economic interests. And there's a lot we can talk about to move from there, but that's the general structure.
Okay, I want to focus on the money portion of it for a minute. And I asked this question fully knowing that there is a legal firewall that was built on purpose that is going to make a lot of these answers impossible to get. You say there's NGO money that goes to these Antifa terror cells. You said it's billionaire money, government money. What billionaires in which government agencies?
Well, I'll start with the billionaires. Very famously, the Open Society Institute, the Open Society Foundations fund all of these groups to take out threats to right-wing extremism and right-wing. Yeah, these are groups that are effectively pro-democracy groups ostensibly, or groups to fight authoritarianism, and they define fascism as right-wing authoritarianism. This is the kind of stuff that actually goes back a very long time. Uh, I want to lay out a framework, actually, if I have a few minutes here to
Please,
understand this.
please.
The role
No,
of
please do.
NGOs in funding extremist movements um, did not doesn't is not a new thing. In the late 1940s, during the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S. State Department, and partnered governments in NATO launched something that was called Operation Gladio. And this ended up being substantially declassified effectively in the 1990s after all of these intelligence documents were revealed in court cases in Italy. And many books have been written about this, but this was a we had just won the World War II against the fascist governments of Italy and Germany. So the governments of both the United States and NATO allies were not pro-fascist by any sense. But another threat emerged to neoliberal commercial interests in Europe from left-wing communism. And because of the threat of Soviet Union advancement politically throughout Central and Eastern Europe and even into Western Europe, the US government, in tandem with our NATO allies, funded to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in the aggregate over the decades what they called stay behind networks of extreme right wing groups, what you might call kind of fascist adjacent right wing groups that were very deeply anti-communist. Now, the CIA did not fund that because they wanted fascists to take power back. And they didn't fund it on ideological grounds. They funded it the same way they fund ISIS and Al Qaeda to take out Bashar al-Assad. The Many of these front groups, religious organizations, media assistance, paramilitary assistance. This was in almost every European country. There were these right-wing, fascist adjacent groups who would break up meetings, for example, violently when left-wing communists would attempt to organize, who would crack skulls and crack bones, who would effectively create a climate in which it was very hostile to be a left-wing communist. And this was seen as something that was necessary to support covertly by the US government and NATO, because these were radicals who were willing to take out it was like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But it was very deeply organized and structured. There were formal cells, and they were very secretive, like the P2 lounge in Italy and the like, where you had this kind of secret membership. They brought in folks from all walks of the business community, the media community, the government allies, the civil society folks. They structured them into these cluster cells, and that was effective for the Western world to stop the rise of left-wing communism, to contain its rise during the Cold War. What I believe has been going on for the past 10 years, in sync with what has happened with the organized structure of the censorship industrial complex, it had these very same kind of networks and structures, I believe, have been constructed for the so-called anti-fascist groups to stop the rise of right-wing populism, that were done to help what you might call the fascist groups to stop left-wing communism during the 20th century. What you see is a pattern match, country by country. Antifa has been violently wiping out and stopping the ability to either organize or host speeches or mobilize or articulate anything at all without getting your skull bashed in Germany, in France, in Spain. These violent, effectively Antifa terror cells are stopping the rise of the blob of the uniparty State Department, Intel, military, and Chamber of Commerce allies. All of their enemies in Europe have had their skulls cracked by Antifa, while all of these Antifa incubator places in the universities, in the media space, in the civil society organizations, in the trade organizations, in the labor organizations, are getting hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of U.S. aid, of uh, of pass-through U.S. aid through subgrants, and I we know that that structure was done to take out political enemies internationally in the 20th century. We know that that structure existed with the censorship industrial complex. I want to know, and I believe that Tulsi Gabbard at ODNI has this power, as well as their comparables at the State Department, USAID, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and other places. I want to know if we've got an inverse Gladio situation, that the same way NATO feared Brexit, Frexit, Italexit, Gorexit, and these Antifa groups all used violent terroristic force in order to stop events like that from happening. I want to know if you open up the CIA files at ODNI, who's got oversight over CIA, where these Antifa groups have military grade OPSEC. Anyone who's been in the space will tell you just the unbelievable military grade nature of the secrecy with which things are conducted, the multiple burner phones, the multiple passwords and vetting to be able to enter closed door meetings or get access to anyone in the leadership of these things. You look at the very strange following and followed on all of the major Antifa accounts, and you'll see it's riddled with following and followed by very strange figures in the military and intelligence world, while those same groups are taking out the exact targets of folks who belong to those agencies. I believe that if you were to open up the intelligence files and open up the US aid files and open up potentially, I don't know that state would uh, that might be a little bit too spicy for state. It would probably be farmed out to CIA or USAID or USAGM or one of these others. But I believe we have a right to know. This is something that I think the intelligence community will howl and moan about because it will expose sources and methods. And how will any group around the world trust America again to work with their spy agencies if they know that their identities and networks will be revealed if the wrong person wins the election? Well, then I was going to curse, but well, then you shouldn't have friggin' weaponized it domestically. You crossed the line. You crossed the line this time. If you wanted to keep this as a global influence operation, then you should not have brought that war home. This is like funding ISIS and then having ISIS terror attacks on U.S. soil. You support this network around the world. These networks that are global mingle domestically. The flow of funds is international. The exchange of ideas is international. When you pump up extremist movements around the world for whatever reason, and even the underlying reason is completely outrageous. This was not a national security threat from the German AfD party. It wasn't a national security threat to the United States if Marine Le Pen became president in France. It wasn't a national security threat to the United States if the Vox party won in Spain. They did it to play politics, which is the last thing you should ever use intelligence for. It's the last thing you should ever use humanitarian relief funds at USAID for. We have a right to know, was this organized? Was this supported? Were these groups used as pawns, as assets, in order to take out political enemies of the state? Right now, we have a declassification power. We could do a WikiLeaks style, a JFK files style post 85,000 documents, run a keyword search, go into the search queries at CIA, USAID, USAGM, put in the word anti-fascist, see what pops up, and publish everything.
Mike, let me ask you this. How does all this tie into this really bizarre, obviously I'm too old to understand it, online world of darkness where this furry, tranny, weird, ugly world, Discord, I know was part of this. How does all this tie in? I'm sure there's a tie-in. I just can't figure it out.
Well, these are channels. So Discord is very popular in the gaming community. It's a very flexible platform and is a very effective tool for content creators online because it allows everyone in the community to have a common channel for sharing uh, their own content that's unique to that community, videos, GIFs. It's also very flexible in that it allows like voice calls, and so it can immediately plug in to allow both text and real-time communication. It's also completely ideologically and institutionally captured by the farthest parts of the far left. As a content creator myself, I've had many, many people tell me, start a Discord, start a Discord. And I always laugh because I think, okay, if I want the folks remember back in 2007, this started as a gaming community tool because it was very all the way that channels work and the way that every video game has its own subculture and then there's kind of overlap between the social and the entertainment side of it. But back in 2017, Discord back end people at Discord were leaking any right wing Discord chat to a group called Unicorn Riot. In fact, there was a Twitter account called Discord Spies, which would publish effectively what people thought were secure communications on the platform because it was just leaked. The back end trust and safety folks and folks behind the content moderation team would just straight up give any conservatives private chats to violent Antifa groups. And that would be used to dox everybody if they were on an alternate account. It would be used to dox their IP address and their location. And these people would be terrorized. So Discord has been one of these extremely captured platforms, and it has marketed itself in a certain respect because of those subcultures to these very far left elements. And among them, you have this kind of Antifa, Trantifa type community where you have uh, essentially pawns of billionaires or intelligence agencies or entrenched political interests love crazy people. They love crazy, stupid people who have what they call a high risk tolerance. I'm just quoting the U.S. Institute of Peace, the U.S. government agency that we give tens of millions of dollars to every year. They recruit what they call high risk tolerance individuals, people who are willing to get arrested. It's a direct quote from the founder of the program on nonviolent action at the U.S. Institute of Peace. People who are willing to get arrested, have a high risk tolerance, willing to block streets and roads, willing to commit property destruction. This is defined as part of the civil resistance nonviolent action toolkit because they say that if you light a police precinct on fire or you burn down someone's house, that's technically nonviolent action, they call it, because they simply define violence out of it by saying, well, it's not bodily harm. No one died in the process of me lighting this police car on fire. And so it's nonviolent, just like they're non-governmental with these NGOs. But the fact is they do also endorse violence. If you look at, for example, the Armed Queer Salt Lake City head, who received accolades from U.S. State Department funded NGOs and the United Nations, openly said, there's an incredible clip where she said, yes, we support violence. We support violent riots. That's how trans people won their rights with the Stonewall riots. They were violent. We need to remember that and be prepared to enact violence. Their recruitment banner has the phrase, "The revolution will not be voted in. Join armed queers." They're calling for an armed revolution as a substitute for voting. I had a half joking tweet where I said, physics tells us that the fastest thing in the universe is the speed of light, but that's not true. The fastest thing in the universe is the speed at which the FBI would descend on a right-wing gun group that calls for an armed revolution as a substitute for voting. The fact is because these groups have been tools of state interests and of billionaire interests for a decade now, they have gotten a get out of law enforcement free card. The way domestic extremism or domestic terrorism has been defined by our Department of Homeland Security, by our FBI, by our intel services, presupposes that it can only come from the right wing, and that there's not even such a thing as organized anti-fascist groups, despite their closed-door meetings and multiple burner phones and organized Twitter accounts and organized Discord channels and mass distribution of hundreds of clubs and riot shields and bricks and arson materials at every instantaneous pop-up riot they do. Despite having institutional support from the professor class, the civil society and NGO class, cover from the media every single time, and zero action by federal law enforcement for a decade about this. Nobody on the right would dare to say what like Destiny came out and said this week about, actually more people need to die and get shot in the face so that conservatives fear showing their faces in public. That is an open embrace of terroristic violence, and nobody in a decade on the right wing would dare to say 10% of that, because they know the speed at which their life would become a Truman Show. Every new friend they meet would be a federal agent from a different office or bureau. Everybody would shun them because they would know they're a Fed. And what scares me is when I hear them say that, I don't think they're Feds. I think they haven't had the fear of the Feds put into them. Because the crazy groups on the right that did this a decade ago, these like Atomwaffen type groups, they were infiltrated and neutralized so fast by federal law enforcement. So I don't want to hear a damn about, this is a weaponization of government, when this was exactly what was done, and it achieved exactly what they said they wanted. The fact is you got to cut the money. You got to declassify all of this. I want to know every single global network that's been instrumentalized for this purpose. And I want to know if that factored into the decision by federal law enforcement to protect these groups at every level for the past decade. Charlie Kirk is dead, and we have a right to know now.
Amen. Mike, freaking dynamite. As always, brother, thank you. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.